Amid the emotional chaos of the modern world, many people find themselves trapped in a profound dilemma. To avoid suffering, they believe they must become cold, distant, almost inaccessible. It is common to hear phrases like, "I can't show weakness," or "feeling too much only makes me suffer." There is a deep-rooted belief that being emotionally untouchable requires the sacrifice of sensitivity, empathy, and often one's own humanity. But to what extent is this true? Depth psychology, especially the monumental work of Carl Jung, reveals a fascinating paradox. True emotional invulnerability does not arise from coldness, but from the conscious integration of our own internal contradictions. For Jung, there is a little explored path between excessive vulnerability and emotional hardening, the transcendent function. Few people know, but this concept, developed by Jung in his work Psychology and Alchemy, 1944, describes a sophisticated psychological ability that goes far beyond simple defense mechanisms. The transcendent function is the capacity to hold within oneself seemingly irreconcilable tensions, such as pain and serenity, firmness and compassion, closeness and distance, without collapsing. It is not about choosing a side, but about creating a higher synthesis that transforms opposites into something new. However, most remain trapped in the logic of the ego, which seeks to protect itself by building ever higher walls. This strategy generates a dangerous side effect. The more the individual defends themselves, the more isolated and empty they feel. The ego believes that to avoid being hurt, it must expel everything that is uncomfortable, distressing, or contradictory. But, according to Jung, this stance only exacerbates suffering, because what is repressed in the unconscious returns to the surface in distorted forms through emotional explosions, physical symptoms, or existential crises. It is at this point that the central question of this video arises. Is it possible to be emotionally untouchable without becoming cold? Carl Jung would answer yes, but that this requires courage, discipline, and above all, a deep commitment to the process of individuation. He argued that authentic strength lies not in rigidity, but in the flexibility of the psyche, capable of embracing both light and darkness. Truly untouchable people are not those who close themselves off in an emotional cocoon, but those who have learned to dance with their own shadows without losing their human warmth. In this video, we will explore how the transcendent function can be applied in real life. We will understand, through Jung's lenses, how someone can remain emotionally protected without needing to build ice walls around their heart. We will discuss the conflict between the ego and the self, the concept of holding the tension, sustaining opposites without fragmenting, and how the alchemical process of the psyche transforms deep pains into psychological gold. All of this, not only to satisfy intellectual curiosity, but to offer practical tools to those surrounded by criticism, rejection, betrayal, or toxic environments, without knowing how to protect themselves without losing their humanity. Because, deep down, the question that echoes in the silence of many souls is simple. How can I shield myself from the pains of the world without becoming cold and distant? And perhaps by the end of this video, the answer will not only be theoretical, but profoundly transformative. There is a deeply rooted idea in contemporary culture, and perhaps in any society that values strength and independence, that to survive emotionally, one must become cold. Many believe there are only two paths. Either one is too vulnerable, surrendering to the constant risk of being hurt, or one builds a cold wall around the heart, avoiding any possibility of pain. This narrative, although seductive, is, in Carl Jung's view, not only incomplete, but also dangerous. The myth of coldness as a form of protection arises from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of humiliation, fear of being betrayed or manipulated. From an early age, we learn that showing emotion can be interpreted as weakness. How many times have we not heard phrases like, Don't show what you feel, or people will use it against you. Popular culture feeds this myth through seemingly invincible characters, portrayed as distant, controlled, indifferent, figures who do not cry, do not falter, do not hesitate. They are heroes or heroines who seem untouchable simply because they have suppressed any trace of humanity that could betray them. But what few realize is the high price paid for this defense. Jung warned that the ego, when it tries to protect itself too much, creates a defense system so rigid that it ends up isolating the individual, not only from pain, but also from life. The same wall that prevents the arrows of pain from reaching us also blocks human warmth, genuine joy, and the capacity for deep connection. The price of coldness is loneliness, the superficiality of bonds, and often a sense of emptiness that is almost existential. This defensive behavior may even work for a while. Indeed, there are situations where we need to contain emotions so as not to be overwhelmed by them, whether in a family crisis, an unexpected layoff, or a painful betrayal. However, living permanently in this state of emotional containment is like contracting all the muscles in the body without ever relaxing. At some point, the tension takes its toll. Jung observed this countless times in his patients. People who appeared strong, armored against any suffering, began to show physical or emotional symptoms: chronic anxiety, insomnia, panic attacks, outbursts of anger for no apparent reason. It is as if the unconscious screamed to be heard, bringing to the surface everything the ego tried to suppress. Because the psyche, according to Jung, does not tolerate imbalances for long. What is pushed into the shadows returns with a vengeance. There is yet another important dimension. Coldness as protection paradoxically generates more vulnerability. When the individual distances themselves from themselves and their emotions, they lose the ability to read nuances in others. They become blind to subtleties, to the real intentions of the people around them. This makes them more susceptible to manipulation precisely because, in the attempt not to feel, they disconnect from instinct, intuition, and the emotional wisdom that could truly protect them. Furthermore, living emotionally frozen hinders learning. The pains, no matter how terrible, bring with them valuable lessons. It is through wounds that we often discover our limits, our values, our strength. Those who shield themselves too much prevent themselves from growing. They become rigid, predictable, unable to adapt. And Jung saw this rigidity as a great enemy of individuation, the process through which a human being becomes who they truly are. The big question then remains, if it is not through coldness that we become untouchable, what is the way? How to protect the heart without becoming a cold fortress? And this is where the concept that can completely change the way we see true emotional strength comes in. In the next part, we will explore the central idea that Carl Jung brought to the world, the Transcendent Function, and discover why it is perhaps the only real way to be untouchable without becoming cold. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. At the heart of Carl Jung's analytical psychology is a concept that, although little known outside the deeper circles of psychology, possesses immense transformative power: the transcendent function. For those seeking to be emotionally untouchable without hardening or isolating themselves from the world, understanding this concept is absolutely essential. Jung observed, over decades of clinical study, that the human psyche is not built to function solely at extremes. Within each person coexist opposing forces: love and hate, courage and fear, compassion and indifference, the desire for connection and the desire for isolation. According to him, human suffering often arises not from the existence of these opposites, but from the ego's desperate attempt to choose only one side, repressing or denying the other. The transcendent function is Jung's answer to this dilemma. It is a psychic process in which consciousness, that is, the ego and the unconscious, unite to generate something entirely new. A higher synthesis that does not deny any of the poles but integrates them. It is not a mediocre compromise between two extremes, but a third way capable of transcending contradiction. For example, one can deeply love another person while simultaneously feeling the need to impose firm boundaries. The limited ego tends to think, either I love and give myself completely, or I protect myself and raise barriers. But the transcendent function allows one to sustain the tension between these forces and create an internal space where one can love and maintain clear boundaries, without guilt, without internal violence. Another example is dealing with the pain of betrayal. The ego wants simple answers, either completely forgive and forget, or brutally cut the person out of one's life. Jung would say that the true path involves sustaining the pain without denying it, transforming that experience into inner growth. The transcendent function does not eliminate pain, but transforms its meaning. It is important to understand that for Jung, this process is not merely intellectual. It is not enough to rationally understand that opposites are at play. The transcendent function involves emotion, imagination, symbolism, dreams, everything that connects the conscious with the unconscious. Often, the synthesis manifests through symbolic images, sudden insights, or even dreams that reveal solutions that the logical mind would never find. For this reason, Jung associated the process of the transcendent function with the work of medieval alchemists. They sought to unite opposing substances, such as the sun and the moon, the masculine and the feminine, to create the philosopher's stone. For Jung, alchemy was a perfect metaphor for the psychic process through which we transform suffering into wisdom, tension into serenity, pain into meaning. The greatest mistake, according to Jung, is to believe that we must choose between being vulnerable and being strong. True strength lies in enduring the tension of opposites without rushing to find an easy solution. Because in that uncomfortable space, where there are doubts, pain, and ambivalence, transformation occurs. But how to begin cultivating this skill in real life? How to learn to hold the tension without collapsing under the weight of one's own emotions? How not to succumb to the anxiety that arises when we do not immediately choose one side or the other? This is exactly what we will explore in the next part, when we will discuss one of the most challenging and powerful concepts in Jung's work: holding the tension, or the art of sustaining contradictory emotions without breaking. Within the vast universe of Jungian psychology, perhaps there is no more fundamental and more misunderstood conflict than the clash between the ego and the self. For Jung, this is the silent battle that shapes almost all human decisions, sufferings, and existential dilemmas. Understanding this relationship is crucial for those seeking to be emotionally untouchable without falling into the trap of coldness. The ego, for Jung, is the part of the psyche that identifies with consciousness. It is the I that says, I am so-and-so, I have such opinions, such tastes, such fears. It is the seat of will, social identity, and logic. The ego believes it is in control, and to some extent it is. It is absolutely necessary for navigating the external world, making decisions, setting boundaries, and protecting oneself from immediate dangers. But the great misconception of the ego is to imagine that it is everything, and above all, to believe that it can, on its own, guarantee absolute security against the pains of the world. Jung was relentless in showing that this illusion of self-sufficiency is precisely what makes us more fragile. This is because the ego, when isolated, perceives reality in a limited, one-sided way. It divides everything into rigid categories: good or bad, right or wrong, vulnerable or protected. It wants quick answers, absolute control, and the illusion that it can shield the individual from any suffering. This is where the self comes in. Jung described the self as the center and totality of the psyche, encompassing both consciousness and the unconscious. The self is not just another part of the mind, it is the instance that contains everything we are, even that which we do not know within ourselves. It is the source of balance, purpose, and existential meaning. While the ego is focused on the external world and social adaptation, the self is oriented towards the totality of human experience. Jung asserted that true emotional protection does not come from the ego, but from the self. Because the self, by integrating opposites, generates a much more solid internal security than any wall erected by the ego. When someone is aligned with the self, they do not need to defensively react to criticism, rejection, or betrayal, because there is an intimate certainty of completeness. It is not that the person does not feel pain, but they do not break in the face of it. There is something greater, an internal axis that remains firm. One of Jung's greatest insights was realizing that the more the ego tries to protect itself through rigid control, the more it disconnects from the self, and paradoxically, the more vulnerable it becomes. This is the case for people who live tense, distrustful, isolated lives, always afraid of being hurt, and who, therefore, end up living in a permanent state of anxiety or bitterness. The ego is in constant war, but this war is against internal enemies projected onto the external world. The self, on the other hand, does not need to fight. It offers a natural protection that comes from the feeling of wholeness. As Jung wrote, the self is both the center and the circumference. It is the fixed point around which everything revolves, but it is also the whole that contains each of the parts. Living aligned with the self means accepting our contradictions, recognizing our shadows, but also trusting in the possibility of integration. That is why people who seem untouchable without being cold often convey a serenity that is not feigned. They know their pains, but they do not define themselves by them. They know they can love intensely without losing their individuality. They can set boundaries without cruelty, because their strength does not come from hardening, but from this intimate connection with the self. But connecting to the self is not simple. It is not a button that can be pressed. It is a process that requires enduring deep internal tensions without rushing to easy solutions. This is where an essential concept comes in, and for many, one of the most challenging aspects of Jungian psychology, the art of holding the tension, that is, sustaining contradictory emotions without collapsing. In the next part, we will dive deep into this concept and understand how it is, in practice, the path to transforming pain into wisdom and achieving that transparent shielding that makes us untouchable without ever losing our humanity. Few things are as difficult for humans as remaining in the crossfire of their own emotions. When we are betrayed, criticized, or rejected, everything within us cries out for immediate relief. We either explode outward with anger or cutting words, or implode inward, suppressing the pain until it becomes a silent knot in our chest. The temptation of the ego is to quickly choose a side. Either we become cold and indifferent, or we sink into a sea of suffering. But Carl Jung saw another path, as demanding as it is liberating, the art of holding the tension. For Jung, holding this tension is the essential condition for the process of the transcendent function to occur. Without it, there is no transformation, only neurotic repetition. He realized that every time we avoid facing contradictory feelings, we are merely pushing those contents into the unconscious, where they grow and become even more powerful. And it is there that symptoms like anxiety, depression, insomnia, explosive anger, or even psychosomatic illnesses arise. But holding the tension does not mean living in constant suffering or cultivating pain as if it were a virtue. It means something much more sophisticated, remaining aware of the pain while simultaneously refusing to succumb to despair or denial. It is having the courage to look within and admit, I feel anger and love at the same time. I want distance, but I also desire closeness. I am hurt, but I am also capable of compassion. It is in that uncomfortable space, full of ambivalence, that the possibility of synthesis is born. Jung said that the psyche is like an alchemical laboratory. When two opposing substances are mixed, the heat of conflict generates transformation. Similarly, when we hold the tension between opposing emotions without prematurely choosing a side, something new can emerge. A new vision, an insight, a deeper understanding of ourselves or the situation we face. A clear example is dealing with the pain of betrayal. The ego immediately wants to decide, either forgive everything and pretend nothing happened, or cut ties and completely shut down. But holding the tension means admitting that there is legitimate pain, while also recognizing that this pain does not define the whole story. It means feeling the hurt without letting it destroy the ability to trust again in the future. It is asking oneself, what is this pain trying to teach me? What is the hidden gold in this experience? Another example is facing harsh criticism. The immediate impulse of the ego may be to react with aggression or fall into a spiral of destructive self-criticism. But those who can hold the tension can ask, is there something true in what was said? Or is this criticism more about the other than about me? And most importantly, they can remain calm enough not to be swept away by someone else's drama. The greatest challenge of this process is that it requires time. The ego wants immediate solutions, ready answers, certainties. But the deep psyche operates at a different pace. Jung compared this to the alchemical process, which needed patience, constant heat, and vigilance to transform lead into gold. Holding the tension is, therefore, an act of psychological and spiritual discipline. It is refusing easy solutions even when everything within us begs to escape the pain. And there is a fundamental detail. It is not just about enduring suffering. It is about allowing the pain to transform us. Because in Jung's view, every wound we consciously bear makes us more whole. That is why he said that the goal is not perfection, but completeness. The pain does not magically disappear, but it begins to have meaning. It integrates into our story as an important chapter, not as a sentence of destruction. But then the inevitable question arises. If holding the tension is so powerful, how can we truly transform this painful experience into something valuable? How can we convert lead into psychological gold? This is precisely what we will discuss in the next part, when we dive into the fascinating concept of alchemical synthesis, the process by which the psyche transforms traumatic experiences into wisdom and emotional resilience without ever losing human warmth. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. In Carl Jung's view, the human psyche possesses an extraordinary power, the power to transform suffering into something of inestimable value. For him, this process is comparable to alchemy, the ancient art that, in medieval workshops, sought to convert common metals, like lead, into pure gold. But Jung did not see alchemy merely as a chemical experiment. He viewed it as the most powerful metaphor for the functioning of the human soul, and it is here that the concept of alchemical synthesis is born. The ability to create meaning and inner strength from what, at first glance, seems only pain and destruction. When we talk about alchemy, many people think of mystical formulas or charlatanism. But for Jung, alchemy was a symbolic language through which ancient generations attempted to describe profoundly psychological processes. The alchemists spoke of solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. In psychological terms, it means breaking down old ways of being and allowing something new and higher to form in their place. And this, Jung said, is exactly what happens when we face traumas, losses, or existential crises. Pain, according to Jung, is not a mistake of life. It is an invitation to transformation. But there is an indispensable requirement. One must sustain the tension without rushing into easy solutions, as we explored in the previous section. If someone, in the face of intense suffering, simply represses it or sweeps it under the rug, the psychological lead remains unchanged, corroding the psyche from within. But if that person accepts to dive into the process, even fearing to lose themselves, there is a real possibility of converting suffering into wisdom, compassion, and inner strength. Alchemical synthesis involves, above all, an act of conscious surrender. It is not about accepting pain as something good or desirable, but about recognizing that it is present and needs to be integrated into the personal story. Often, this integration emerges in symbolic dreams, creative images, unexpected insights. Jung observed in numerous patients that, after periods of great suffering, symbols would arise indicating a reconciliation of opposites. Images of union, such as the mystical marriage, the sun and moon fused, or figures of radiant gold. These symbols are not merely poetic. They are signs that the psyche has found a way to reconcile opposing forces, transforming chaos into inner order. A classic example is someone who goes through a devastating betrayal. The ego, at first, sees only destruction, loss of trust, pain, anger. But through the alchemical process, that same experience can become the spark that awakens a deeper understanding of boundaries, self-love, and the very capacity for emotional regeneration. In the end, the person does not return to who they were before. They become more aware, more solid, and less susceptible to repeating destructive patterns. This is psychological gold. Another fundamental aspect of alchemical synthesis is that it creates a unique form of emotional protection, something Jung called transparent shielding. In other words, the person becomes protected, but without isolating themselves from the world. They are able to maintain empathy, human warmth, and connection, but at the same time, they are not easily knocked down by manipulations, criticisms, or external dramas. Their strength does not lie in rigid walls, but in deep roots. Therefore, people who have gone through great pains and have consciously integrated them possess a different presence. They radiate serenity, not because they have not suffered, but because they have learned to use suffering as a catalyst for growth. Jung said that the goal of life is not to avoid suffering, but to make it meaningful. Alchemical gold is not the absence of pain, but the ability to look at it and say, "I am greater than this." But then the big practical question arises: how to apply all this in everyday life? How to live loving relationships, friendships, and work environments without falling back into old patterns of coldness or extreme vulnerability? How to maintain human warmth while not being swallowed by others' drama? This is precisely what we will discuss in the next part. We will explore how to practically apply all these Jungian concepts in real-life situations, from the simplest to the most painful, to finally discover how to be untouchable without ever losing our humanity. As you reach the end of this journey, a truth emerges that is as unsettling as it is liberating. Being emotionally untouchable does not mean being cold, distant, or closed off to the world. It means, above all, cultivating an inner strength that arises from the conscious union of our deepest opposites. Many believe that to avoid suffering, one must harden the heart. That showing feelings is to expose weaknesses. That the only way to avoid being hit by the cruel arrows of life is to build walls so high that no one can cross them. But as we have seen through the lenses of Jung's psychology, this strategy is a trap. For the same wall that protects from pain also deprives us of human warmth, genuine joy, and the depth of true connections. True power lies not in coldness, but in the ability to sustain internal contradictions without collapsing. Jung showed us that the human soul is a battlefield where opposing forces coexist: love and anger, the desire for closeness and the need for distance, trust and fear. And that the path to becoming untouchable without losing humanity is precisely to learn to remain in this unstable territory without rushing to choose sides, without jumping to easy solutions, without surrendering to despair. Sustaining the tension is an act of extreme courage. It is to stand before pain without denying its existence. It is to look at one's own shadows and recognize them as legitimate parts of who we are. It is to have the discipline to endure discomfort until something new, something transformative, emerges from this internal confrontation. This is how Jung saw alchemy as the perfect metaphor for the human psychological process. Just as alchemists sought to transform base metals into gold, we too have the potential to convert our wounds, traumas, and pains into wisdom, compassion, and serenity. This is the true psychological gold. And when we achieve this internal transmutation, the state that Jung called transparent shielding arises. We are no longer hostages to others' manipulations. We are not easily shaken by criticism or rejection. We maintain firmness, but we also preserve human warmth, empathy, and genuine connection with others. This is the essence of being untouchable without ever losing humanity. But this is not a fixed destination. It is a path, a constant practice, a daily decision not to flee from oneself, to look within, even when what we see frightens us, and to trust that from internal chaos, a deeper order can emerge. If there is one thing this video aims to make clear, it is that you do not have to choose between being strong or being sensitive. You can be both. You can love deeply and at the same time set boundaries. You can be vulnerable without being fragile. You can suffer and still remain whole. Now, I want to know from you, in which area of your life do you feel you most need to find this balance between strength and vulnerability? Is there a situation where you felt you closed off too much or, on the contrary, exposed yourself more than you should have? Write in the comments. Your story may inspire or help others who are going through the same dilemma. And if this video brought important reflections for you, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. And keep watching the next video. It is just as important as this one for your process of self-knowledge and inner strengthening. Because in the end, the journey to become truly untouchable without ever losing your humanity is just beginning.